If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. Rudyard Kipling. So welcome to a series of lectures which I've chosen to title The Story of the Northwest Passage. It's a rather grandiose title for me to be employing here, and I certainly do not claim to be telling the entire history of this enormous body of water which has fascinated explorers for centuries. But I chose this title because it is my aim with this lecture series to give my listeners an introduction, a broad introduction to the history of European exploration throughout the Northwest Passage. So we will take the stories of 4 different explorers who each journeyed to the Northwest Passage. And over the course of examining these 4 lives, we will, I believe and I hope, discover much of the intricacy of the history of these northern waters and why it was that they fascinated explorers and indeed claimed so many lives over several centuries. It is, of course, a long story. We will go all the way from the first rumours and whispers of a Northwest Passage's existence, and we will end finally in the first successful navigation. So, with that little introduction out of the way, I will begin. Stay and listen close to the story I shall tell. Mind the whispers and the ghosts that in this passage dwell. Chapter 1. John Cabot. Our story begins in the 15th century, in the vibrant, thrilling centre of the Renaissance. We begin, of course, in Italy. Now, Italy, in this period, bore very little resemblance to the modern nation-state we know Italy as today. When I speak of Italy, I'm speaking rather of the Italian peninsula, because in the 15th century this peninsula was divided into a wide array of independent kingdoms and republics and duchies. To the south we had the powerful kingdom of Sicily, and in the heart of the peninsula there were the papal states. Now these papal states were, as the name implies, overseen by the all-powerful Bishop of Rome. And to the north we had the equally powerful Duchy of Milan, and finally to the northeast we had the Republic of Venice, or as it was officially known, the Most Serene Republic of Venice. And it is in the Republic of Venice where this story begins. The Republic of Venice, or Serenissima Repubblica di Venezia in Venetian, was an independent state for 1100 years. So it lasted from 697 until 1797. And it was, in fact, for much of its existence, not only one of the most powerful nations in the Italian peninsula, but indeed in the world at that time. Now, the people of Venice spoke their own language. They didn't speak Italian, but Venetian, as you just heard in the name. And their ruler was known as the Doge, and this Doge was in turn elected by the Grand Council of Venice, or Maggior Consiglio. So it was a very unique system of governance for its time in Renaissance Europe. And of course I mentioned that this was one of the most powerful states in the world. Well, why was this? It's really very simple. It is the case for almost all European empires. Venice's power came from the ocean and its access to it. So during its height, the Republic of Venice established an enormous maritime empire throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. And that was through its control of its navy and thereby its control of the high seas. And of course, what we see in all empires throughout history is with great wealth and power comes also a great yearning for knowledge and study. This is the same for the Romans and for the Greeks, and it was also the same in the Venetian Empire. This money allowed greater intensity of education and learning and culture to develop. So besides being an economic centre, Venice was also a cultural centre within Europe. Whilst in the Papal States, the Catholic Church and the Bishop of Rome sought to censor and suppress new science and new learning, Venice, on the other hand, established itself as a safe haven for scholars and artists and writers everywhere. And besides being a haven of art, Venice was also a haven for science. And one of the branches of science during this period that was very intensively supported was the science of navigation and the promise of exploration it held. So the Venetian Republic was widely known as being a region inhabited by some of the most enormously wealthy merchants in Europe. And it was these powerful merchants of Venice, who of course gave the name to Shakespeare's play, it was these wealthy merchants of Venice who sponsored the first explorers to venture out into the distant lands of Asia and Africa during the Renaissance and even much before the Renaissance. So the incentive for the merchants was to support science, because with the advancement of science there came the advancement of possibilities for navigation, so the possibility to navigate over greater and greater stretches of the world accurately and reliably. So yes, the merchants of Venice were eager to put their money into explorers who would go out and make new discoveries for them. And Marco Polo is of course one of Venice's most famous sons, and it was only due to the patronage and support of Venetian merchants that Polo was able to launch his travels to Asia beginning in 1271, traversing the famous Silk Roads. But we'll move forward from the 13th century now. We'll move several centuries forward because our story actually begins around the year 1450. And it's believed that around this time, a man by the name of Giovanni Cabot was born. In the Anglophone world, he is of course better known as John Cabot. Now, Cabot was born probably in Genoa, but he moved as a young child to Venice with his family. And he grew up and lived a fairly inconspicuous youth in Venice, but did ply his trade on ships. And we know that in 1476, at around the age of 25, Cabot was granted something very valuable, and that was full Venetian citizenship. This was something that was actually considerably difficult to attain. It required several years of residency there and also a few more hoops to jump through. And this was a great asset to Cabot that set him up in his career. Having the power and luxury of Venetian citizenship essentially of the citizenship of one of the most powerful maritime empires at the time, was very useful to him. And what this meant was that he was able to then enter the maritime world and begin a marine career. So he boarded merchant ships and he began to sail around the Mediterranean, slowly working his way up through the ranks of these ships. And he began to venture as far as Egypt, Israel, and Lebanon. And soon enough, Cabot became a very well-respected sailor and merchant. And in 1484, Cabot married his wife, Matea, and she bore him several sons, and one of these sons was Sebastian Cabot, and we will come back to Sebastian later in this story. So, all seemed to be going rather well for Cabot. He had a family, and he was working well in the shipping industry. But by the late 1480s, this began to change, and it appears that Cabot actually began to have got into some quite serious financial difficulty with debt. And so in 1488 he moved himself and his family to Valencia in Spain. And he apparently thought that this would put an end to his troubles, simply moving away from Venice. But of course, debt is a perennial curse which has afflicted man for all of its existence. Cabot was perhaps a little naive in thinking this would solve his problems, because of course the Venetian Republic was very powerful and held great sway within Europe. And Cabot's Venetian creditors actually attempted to have him extradited back to Venice, and they did this with the equivalent at its time of an Interpol notice. So in the same way that governments around the world can issue notices which demand other countries' police forces to send to capture miscreants for them, Venice was able to do the same at the time, and what happened was the Venetian authorities they actually mailed a document which was known as a lettera di raccomandazione a giustizia, or a letter of recommendation for justice. And so they issued that to the local authorities where Cabot lived, so he was not safe, and his creditors were hot on his tail. So what did he do? Well, he simply moved once more. So he moved further to the west, this time to the city of Sevilla. And it was here, during his time in Sevilla, which Cabot spent in the bustling trade hub here, that he began to gain an interest in exploration and the new world which had just been discovered. And I think, in fact, this was a formative period in Cabot's life. He was in a cosmopolitan centre of trade and exploration. Ships were leaving here, sailing off to new places, and I think this must have enticed and interested Cabot very greatly. At this time, at this point in history, the Indies, or modern-day Asia, were the most lucrative and profitable ports of trade for European merchants. But the problem simply was that sailing around the entire African continent was not only very dangerous, but also hugely expensive, and it required several stops along the way. As you can see in this map, it was important to stop in Mombasa before heading on to Calicut or Calcutta in India. So the merchants and traders of Europe were keen to discover an alternative passage across the Atlantic which would take them to Asia faster and more efficiently than ever before. The idea of a route to the Indies across the Atlantic had been proposed and theorized already for many years. And this was, of course, because scholars and astronomers were abundantly aware that the Earth was spherical, and so that sailing west could therefore lead them to the east. This is, of course, a common misconception which was advanced actually only in the 20th century. This idea that people of the ancient world did not know that the Earth was round. This is, of course, completely false. The Greeks knew the Earth was round by observation of obelisks in different cities. So they observed the differing lengths of shadows between Alexandria and different places in the empire. So all the way, all throughout this time, humanity and all merchants and scholars alike were very aware that the Earth was round. And so the idea of sailing to the west in search of the east was not something novel. But really it was only in 1492, with the voyage of Christopher Columbus, as we see here, it was only then that the first real systematic European exploration began in terms of land beyond the Atlantic. Now, of course, we have to add in an addendum here, which was that the Vikings, of course, had already been to North America. They had landed probably somewhere on the coast of Newfoundland at an archaeological site which was only recently discovered called Lons O Meadows. So that was Leif Erikson. But Viking incursion into North America, by all the evidence we have found, was very slight, and it was not the same levels that we see later in Europe, because of course with Columbus's landing in the modern day Caribbean and Central America, this kick-started real systematic European incursion and colonization of the American continent. And this is something that did not occur with the Vikings and Vinland. So let's move back again to the 15th century. So Columbus had funded his voyages through the Spanish monarchy. Cabot, however, did not seek his patronage from the Spanish crown, and instead he decided to travel to England in 1495. Giovanni Cabot became John Cabot. This was something very common in Europe at this time. When people moved between countries, they would change their names. So in this case, Cabot anglicized his name into John Cabot in order to better fit in with his new surroundings. And this was also in aid of preventing oneself from being seen too much as a foreigner. So, upon his arrival in England, Cabot went straight to London, and it was there that he began communication with the English royal court. And finally, in 1496, King Henry VII granted Cabot a royal patent, and this patent empowered Cabot to explore, investigate, and to claim any lands as yet unknown to Christians. Cabot's aim was to sail westward across the vast Atlantic, following in the footsteps of Columbus. However, rather than sailing south, Cabot aimed to sail further north in the hopes of discovering a passage through the New World to the Indies. However, the royal patent did not actually offer Cabot any financial support for his endeavour, and so after receiving this, Cabot had an equally large task. All he had gained was the support, a name, and the acceptance and permission of the English monarchy to go out and do this. He hadn't actually received any significant funds, and so he had to set about this enormous task. And finally, in March of 1496, he received the enormous sum of £16 and 13 shillings, and that was the equivalent of 15,000 US dollars today. And the reason he received this money was because he went to a wealthy family, the Bardi family of Florentine bankers of the city of Florence. And so they, perhaps seeing a fellow man from the Italian peninsula, they decided to support Cabot and gifted him this enormous sum. And so after this, over the course of several months, Cabot eventually raised all of the necessary funds to begin preparations. And in the late summer of 1496, Cabot finally set sail from Bristol on his first voyage. However, it is at this point I must come clean and reveal that Cabot's first voyage is an almost complete mystery. In fact, we only know that he set sail sometime in the late summer of 1496. No records from Cabot himself survive, and all we have, in fact, is a letter known as the John Day letter, written by a Mr. John Day, who was a wealthy and connected merchant who lived and traded in Bristol. And this is the letter you're seeing here, an excerpt, I should say, of the letter you're seeing on the screen here. And I wonder if you can imagine who John Day was asked to write this letter to. I think it's very interesting and it says a lot. It was, in fact, addressed to none other than Signor Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo. And it's actually believed that Columbus was eager to hear the stories and the fates of what were happening with his rivals, and so he requested to know just exactly what this John Cabot was doing in the New World that he believed he had just discovered. So it says a lot about the political climate of the time, and dispels some of the myths and stories of romance about the New World. Right from the get-go, discovery in America was about money and power and territory, and Columbus wanted to know just what other countries were doing in this land. So this is the letter that John Day wrote to Columbus. "Since your lordship wants information relating to the first voyage, here is what happened. He went with one ship, his crew confused him, he was short of supplies, and he ran into bad weather, and he decided to turn back." This letter is all we have telling us about the first Cabot voyage. And it is, of course, written in the vernacular of its time. We have to be very careful about making conclusions about just exactly what John Day is referring to here. It feels very ambiguous to us, but again, we are looking at this with modern eyes and modern English. In the letter he says his crew confused him. Now there's lots of conclusions we could draw from this, which is of course that English has changed like all languages. It has changed considerably in the meaning of its words over time. A good example of this is that the word meddled, actually in Elizabethan writing and indeed in the plays of Shakespeare, we've seen it was used to actually imply a meaning of rape, so a much darker meaning than today if we would say that somebody meddled with someone else. And so from evidence such as this we can infer that it is possible that perhaps confused as it is used here could mean something rather more serious than we would interpret it today. This could mean that his crew actually rebelled against him, and it was therefore impossible for him to continue. But we will not know for certain. We cannot know just what John Day intended to convey with this letter. So let's move onwards to Cabot's second voyage. So in the following year, 1497, Cabot set off once more from the city of Bristol, and this time he was in a ship called Matthew. And the chronicle of the city of Bristol, so essentially the logbook of the town, which told all of the significant events which happened throughout the year. In the chronicle of the city of Bristol, this is how Cabot's second voyage was described. This year, on St. John the Baptist's Day, the land of America was found by the merchants of Bristow in a ship of Bristow called the Matthew, the which said ship departed from the port of Bristow on the 2nd day of May. And we also know from the chronicle that the ship set sail with 18 men as its crew. And again, I think it's rather lovely seeing this old English, Middle English spelling of Bristol as Bristow, a ship of Bristow. So, on the 24th of June 1497, the expedition finally made landfall somewhere on the coast of North America, most likely in Newfoundland from the records. And so in so doing, Cabot became, in fact, the first European since the Vikings to set foot in North America. Because, of course, it was also Leif Erikson who landed in Newfoundland. The exact location of this first landing has, however, long been disputed and argued over. This is in part because there is no physical evidence, so we can never know for certain. But also, several communities on the coast of Newfoundland obviously vie for the title of the place where Cabot landed, with their town names and monuments to Cabot. But nonetheless, most sources agree that it was somewhere on the northern coast of Newfoundland. And according to the accounts of those who sailed with him, Cabot in fact only landed once during this entire expedition, and he did not venture into the Green New World as one would expect. He did not venture, in fact, further beyond the shooting distance of a crossbow, as is recorded. This is something very interesting. It's said, in fact, that the crew remained on land just long enough to collect fresh water from the streams and to raise the flag of Venice. Again, this is something very interesting that Cabot decided to do. He raised the Venetian flag, but then he claimed the land for the King of England, and that was, of course, following his royal contract he had made with the King of England. After this, the ship continued sailing southwards and likely explored the jagged Newfoundland coast before finally departing back to England. Once Cabot arrived back in Bristol in August of 1497, he rode straight to London, and there he was handed a reward of £10, so the equivalent of about 2 years' worth of pay for an ordinary worker at the time. And Cabot was celebrated and paraded around London. And a diplomat from Milan wrote at the time of Cabot, rather disparagingly it seems, He is called the Great Admiral, and vast honour is paid to him, and he goes dressed in silk, and these English run after him like mad. Seems there was a lot of fervour about the voyage of Cabot to the New World at this time in England. So in May of 1498, Cabot departed Bristol for the third and final voyage, and this time it was a lavish affair. Cabot was granted 5 different ships, and almost all expenses had been covered by the enthusiastic king. And it is also said that the ships were loaded with valuable goods such as silk and cloth and lace and wool. And this indicates to us that Cabot actually this time intended to trade with the native inhabitants of the distant lands he was going to. However, the records end once again there. The Spanish envoy in London wrote that one of the ships had been caught and damaged in a storm and forced to sail to Ireland, but the 4 other ships with Cabot had continued onwards to the west. But immensely frustratingly, we have no records of what happened next. For centuries it was in fact believed that Cabot and his ships were simply lost at sea. And it's not known, so this is one of the theories, but it could also have been that Cabot simply died during the voyage, or simply chose to live in the New World. And this is another theory that was sometimes advanced. And indeed this option was not unheard of. That was the fate of the French explorer Etienne Brulé. Brulé famously simply decided to live with the Huron people of the Great Lakes, and he became fluent in their language and lived with them for the rest of his life. But perhaps Cabot did not stay in the New World. Perhaps he did return to England. Of course, we need to remember that at this time, records, as we know them today, were not made as meticulously as they are in these days. It was simply a man's word, or a letter, or perhaps a diary that was kept. And of course we have to also remember that we're talking about over 500 years of passing of time. 500 years, just like the tide that rises on the beach. This time can wash away details and notes written in the sand, and the same is true of time. Time is sadly something which loses the details of stories. So, yes, what can we say? Well, one of the most respected scholars of Cabot, someone called Alwyn Ruddock, she claimed actually that Cabot and his expedition returned safely to England in the spring of 1500, and she claimed to have found circumstantial evidence of an epic 2-year voyage along the east coast of North America. One of the pieces of evidence she claimed, for instance, is that there is a world map we still have today by the Spanish cartographer Juan de la Cosa from 1500, and in this chart it charts the North American coast and describes it with a label as a land being discovered by an expedition from England. And so Ruddock claimed this to be evidence of Cabot's voyage, because of course there were no other English expeditions going to the North American coast at this time. But again, this is circumstantial, and we can't say that anything definite here. In 2009, however, the University of Bristol launched the Cabot project, and this was with the aim of searching for possible evidence of Cabot's safe return to England. And at the conclusion of their research, they actually found evidence of records which appeared to place Cabot in London in 1500. And the Cabot project also collaborated with the community of Carbonear in Newfoundland. And the people of this town in Newfoundland actually, many of them believe that their bay was the location of a settlement of Italian friars who disembarked from Cabot's ship and launched a Christian mission there in the New World. So, perhaps Cabot did indeed return. Perhaps he did sail across the east coast of North America. But we will never have definitive answers on just what happened. But what is certain is that he never did discover any further into a passage to the Indies. However, in 1499, something rather interesting happened. One of Cabot's supporters was a man named William Weston of Bristol. And in 1499, William Weston decided to undertake his own expedition to the New World, and he claimed to have sailed in his expedition across the Atlantic to Newfoundland, and then to have sailed up north through what we know today as the Davis Strait, and then up into another wide open strait. And if this is to be relied upon, if Weston is to be trusted, then it's possible that he sailed in fact into the Hudson Strait, and was therefore could therefore be classed as one of the first Europeans in history to make real progress in the search for the Northwest Passage. Entering the Hudson Strait, of course, would lead one on to Hudson Bay, which is one of the routes of the Northwest Passage. So this is something, of course, very fascinating to think about, the first stepping stones on the way to discovery. But once again, we will never know for certain, and of course this is one man's account of a voyage. We know from other instances of history just how unreliable one man's diary and logbook can be. Now, John Cabot himself died likely around the year 1501, again judging by other researches. However, the Cabot story does not end there, because as you will hopefully recall, as I mentioned, Cabot had a son named Sebastian Cabot. Now, Sebastian had already accompanied his father on his earlier voyage, and in the year 1508 he launched his own expedition. And this expedition was with the sole aim, or rather the main aim, of following in his father's footsteps and searching for a passage through the New World. And in 1508, Sebastian Cabot set sail from Bristol, and he sailed at a much higher latitude than his father, and so when he sighted land, it was not Newfoundland, but rather the coast of modern-day Labrador. And according to his log and to the accounts of his crew, Sebastian then followed the coast northwards into the Davis Strait, and then up into what we know as the Hudson Strait. And it is said that at this point they could sail no further due to the fields of icebergs blocking their path. But it is said that before they turned back, they sighted the mouth of a huge expanse of open water. And if we perhaps take this to be the case, and if we accept that they traversed the entire length of the Hudson Strait, then perhaps they were the first European explorers to sight what would become known as the Great Hudson Bay. Of course, once again, we have to be careful here about making claims or making assumptions and conclusions. There are no detailed accounts of the exact position of Sebastian's ships. And so, of course, it could simply be possible that Sebastian Cabot sighted Ungava Bay, which is this smaller bay just to the west of the tip of Labrador. But yes, perhaps he did indeed sight the Hudson Bay. Perhaps this was the son following in the footsteps of his father, and finally making real progress into a discovery of the Great Passage. When he returned home in 1509, Sebastian Cabot found the world around him changing. The world of his father was dying out like a waning candle. The old king, Henry VII, was dead, and his successor, Henry VIII, showed less interest in supporting exploration and discovery. Discovery for discovery's sake was no longer a sufficient impetus in launching an expedition in this kingdom. The goal now was, of course, the wealth and power and the building of empires. So the task had only just begun. A long and arduous journey lay ahead, and the search for the Northwest Passage would claim the lives and legacies of many more intrepid explorers to come. The journey had only just begun. So if you wish to hear the next chapter in the story of the Northwest Passage, then please feel free to watch Chapter 2, Henry Hudson. Thank you very much.